The road was mostly empty, just a stretch of highway cutting through the night. Streetlights flickered by, their light reflecting off the slick pavement. The black car drove steadily in the right lane. Veronica Caldwell had been driving for nearly an hour, her mind still preoccupied with the classified briefing she'd just left. Being the newly appointed FBI director meant long hours and long nights, but she was used to that. What she wasn't used to, what she hadn't expected, was the intense burst of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. She gripped the wheel a little tighter, her eyes darting to the speedometer, 65, to be exact, no more than a mile. No unusual movement, no reason to be pulled over. But the police cruiser behind her didn't budge. She exhaled through her nose and gestured to the right, pulling over to the side of the road. Years of experience told her there was nothing to worry about. She'd worked with law enforcement her entire career, she knew the protocol, she knew the system. But as the patrol car pulled up behind her, something unsettling stirred inside her. The cop was taking too long. Veronica adjusted the rearview mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of him. The driver's side door of the patrol car finally opened. The man who stepped out wasn't someone she recognized. That wasn't surprising, she wasn't used to knowing every cop on the street. But there was something about the way he moved, his posture stiff, almost aggressive. His left hand was on his belt, fingers curled close to his gun, while his right hand swung the flashlight back and forth. When he walked up to her window, Veronica pressed the button to lower it, keeping both hands on the wheel. "Good evening, officer." Her voice was calm and professional. The man looked down at her, his eyes cold. "You were speeding," he said, his voice dry. "I'm sure I was keeping to the speed limit," Veronica replied, still polite but firm. "May I see your badge, officer?" The man's face hardened. "You don't need to know my name. Your papers. Now." Veronica's guarded instincts rose. "Officer, I'm FBI Director Veronica Caldwell. If there's a problem, I'm sure we can handle it professionally." "I don't care who you are," he snapped, his left hand tightening near the gun. The situation was dangerous. She kept her cool but sensed the danger. "I'm cooperating, but you need to tone it down and act within the law." "You think you're above the law?" He smirked, moving closer. Just then, Karma countered. The high beams from an unmarked car flashed, blinding. A resolute voice boomed over the loudspeaker, "Officer, exit the vehicle immediately." The man jumped and backed away. The unmarked car stopped, and two federal agents stepped out, weapons ready. The light flashed across Veronica's face, reflected in the rearview mirror as the patrol car stopped behind her. There was no greeting, no explanation, just a cold voice saying, "License and registration." She bit back a sigh. This was not normal. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" she asked, her voice calm but cautious. The officer chewed his gum slowly, his eyes fixed on her for a long moment before he replied, simply, "License and registration." Veronica didn't immediately follow. Her instincts, the ones that had saved her life more than once in her career, were warning her that something was wrong. She needed to get control of the situation before it got out of hand. "Sir, I'll get my wallet from the passenger seat," she said carefully, keeping her tone mild. When she got no response, she moved slowly, reaching for her wallet and handing over her FBI identification and driver's license. The officer didn't take them. His eyes slid to the ID card and then back to her, his expression unchanged. "FBI?" he asked. She nodded slightly. "Yes, sir." There was a long silence, then suddenly, "Get out of the car." The words were not loud, but they were as sharp as a slap. Veronica blinked, trying to hide her surprise. "Excuse me." The officer took a half step back, his right hand hovering near the gun at his side. The tension in the air felt heavy in her chest. She had followed all the procedures, had identified herself, and yet the officer still treated her like a threat. She had seen this before, not personally, but in situations she had read about in reports, seen in videos. She had no intention of becoming another name on the news. Her heartbeat was steady, but her mind was racing through scenarios. She knew things could escalate in an instant. She also knew how to survive. And then, before she could decide what to do next, the officer's patience ran out. He reached for the doorknob. And that's when she knew everything was about to change. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This was something else entirely. But Veronica wasn't going to let fear dictate what happened next. Because she'd spent her entire career preparing for moments like this. And she wasn't going to go down without a fight. The click of the doorknob sent a jolt through Veronica's body. Not fear, not yet. But a sharp awareness. Her left hand shot out, gripping the inside handle before Officer Daniel Kearns could pull it free. "Sir, step back," she ordered, her voice firm but calm. "You're out of protocol." Kearns didn't move. He gripped the door tighter, his knuckles pale under the strain. "I said step out of the car," his voice was controlled but also nervous. Veronica had dealt with men like him before. Men who mistook authority for dominance. People push the boundaries to see how far they can go. But this wasn't some greedy official in a suit. This was a man with a badge, a gun, and a temper that made him dangerous. She tightened her grip on the doorknob. "On what grounds, officer?" For the first time, Kearns hesitated. His lips parted as if he were searching for an answer. But instead of answering, he did worse. He took a step closer, flashlight still in his left hand, aimed directly at her face. The blinding light made her see nothing but his silhouette. "I don't need to explain to you." Veronica didn't blink. "You must." The beam of the flashlight didn't waver. But his jaw tightened, annoyance replacing any remaining calm. "Ma'am, I don't care who you work for." Veronica's heartbeat was steady, controlled. But the reality of the situation had changed. This is not just an invasion. This is not just a police officer overstepping his authority. This is something much more dangerous. Veronica Caldwell didn't allow herself to feel fear, but tension was tightening in her muscles. She looked straight at the officer in front of her, keeping her tone cold and hard. "Call your superior and see if he cares," she said, trying not to let any of the tremor in her voice show. The sharpness of her words made him angry. The flashlight fell, and before she could react, his free hand slammed into the roof of her car. The sudden explosion, sharp and fierce, cut through the quiet night and echoed across the deserted road. "I told you to get out," he said, his voice low and dangerous. For the first time, Veronica glanced at his name tag, D. Kearns. She would remember that name. Her fingers itched to reach for the phone, but she knew any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. She had seen this too many times before. So she kept her hands in sight and looked straight at him, her eyes cold and piercing, the eyes she used to interrogate tough guys. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice calm but firm. Kearns let out a dry, humorless laugh. "The mistake is thinking you can impose your rank on me." That's when she noticed the change in his posture, the way his right hand twitched near his waist. He was considering something. The air between them grew thick, dangerous. And then, a second car pulled up. Red and blue lights swept across the landscape as another patrol unit pulled up behind Kearns's. For a moment, Veronica felt relieved, until she saw who got out. Another white officer, tall, broad-shouldered, no name tag visible in the glare of the headlights. Kearns didn't even turn around. That told Veronica all she needed to know. This wasn't backup, it was reinforcement. The second officer stepped up beside Kearns, his gaze sweeping over them both before settling on Veronica. "What's the problem?" he asked, his tone casual but not without its probing. Kearns smiled, a cold smile. "Just dealing with a non-compliant driver." Veronica was silent for a second, weighing her options. She was outnumbered, and Kearns knew it. The second officer took a step forward, closing the distance between them. She knew the situation was becoming more dangerous by the second. She stepped out of the car, but it wasn't FBI Director Caldwell. Nor was it Ms. Caldwell, it was Ms. Caldwell. She had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't a hostile negotiation in a foreign country, nor a tactical mission gone wrong. This was home, and right now, home felt dangerous. She took a slow breath, calculating her next move carefully. Because if she messed up, it wouldn't be her writing the report tomorrow, it would be them. The tension was in her bones, thick and suffocating. The second officer stood diagonally behind Kearns, a gesture of quiet solidarity. But this wasn't law enforcement. This was power. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel, as her mind calculated every possible move. If she refused, they would escalate. If she complied, she would be theirs. There was no good choice. "Ma'am," the second officer repeated, his tone deceptively calm. "Step out of the car now." Veronica exhaled slowly through her nose, steadying her heart rate despite the warning signs ringing in her head. She had been in negotiations where a single wrong word could cost someone their life. And now, she needed to stay in control. With deliberate slowness, she reached for the door handle, her other hand raised where it would be visible. Kearns backed away, giving her enough room. As soon as her feet hit the pavement, the cold night air brushed her skin, sending adrenaline racing through her veins. She was vulnerable now. Kearns, tall and lanky, stepped forward, angled just enough to block the dash cam's view. The second officer remained behind, covering every blind spot. No doubt they had done this many times before. "Turn around," Kearns ordered. Veronica didn't move. "You still haven't told me why I'm being detained." Kearns's nostrils flared, a sign of displeasure. "Suspicious behavior," he replied, but his eyes betrayed something more. He sneered, his eyes cold, as if everything was part of a familiar script. "What behavior?" Kearns shook her head, as if Veronica were just another problem to be dealt with, nothing more, nothing less. "Refusal to comply. It's a trap." The words rang in her head like a warning. She knew what was coming. Refusal to comply justified escalation, and compliance meant submission. She knew the game. She'd read the reports. And then Kearns grabbed her wrist, too hard, too fast. Her instincts kicked in immediately. Her body shifted just enough to pull back, without being aggressive. "Get your hands off me," she snapped, her voice cutting sharply through the night. Kearns didn't let go. The second officer took a step closer. "We have a problem here." Kearns tightened his grip. "I think she's resisting." Veronica's stomach tightened at the words. The second officer reached for his radio, his lips parted, ready to spout some justification for a pointless escalation. "Before we had a compliant suspect. A suspect, not a citizen. Not an FBI director. Just a suspect." And then the gun was drawn. Kearns didn't even hesitate. His hand dropped to the holster, uncocking it. Before she could react, the barrel was inches from her face. Time stretched, thinned, and warped around them. Veronica had been trained to respond to crises. She'd faced gang leaders, violent criminals, domestic terrorists. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a street, in the middle of nowhere. And she was unarmed. Her breathing stopped. Both her hands were open, palms facing out, a sign of non-threat. But everything in her body told her to move, to react. She knew how it would end. The silence was suffocating. And then, Kearns spoke. "Do you feel strong?" Veronica felt something inside her shirt, a simmering anger. This had never been about stopping the car. This was about humiliation. Her vision blurred for a moment. Not from fear. Not from anger. But from every name she had seen in reports like this. Those who never got the chance to tell their story. She opened her mouth and chose her next words carefully, because they might be her last. But before she could speak, a voice cut through the night. "Hey, I'm recording this." The scream came from somewhere nearby, cutting through the tense air like a knife. It wasn't just the words, it was the power behind them. Someone had seen. And more importantly, someone had proof. Kearns didn't lower his gun, but the change in his demeanor was instantaneous. A moment of hesitation, a quick glance toward the voice. Veronica followed his gaze, barely turning her head. A man stood near the edge of the road, his phone raised, the light of the screen reflecting off his glasses. He was at a safe distance, but close enough to capture every detail. Close enough for the world to see. "Are you sure you want to do this, officer?" the man asked, his voice surprisingly calm despite the suffocating weight of the moment. Kearns's jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. The second officer stepped forward, moving as if considering damage control. But they were no longer in control. Veronica saw it in their eyes, the calculation, the panic weighing on their authority. They were used to being comfortable in the shadows, in the silence of the unrecorded. But this was different. Kearns exhaled sharply, his fingers still tightening around the grip of his gun. His next move would decide everything. Veronica knew she had to push. "Drop your weapon," she said, her voice echoing, stronger than before. Kearns didn't move, his breathing now shallow and rapid. His mind was working overtime to find a way out. The second officer's radio crackled. "Status Unit 47. There was a breathless silence, then the siren sounded, distant at first but growing closer. The reinforcement was coming, but not the kind of reinforcement they wanted. Finally, Kearns relaxed his grip. His hand dropped slightly. Kearns still didn't put his weapon away, but now the muzzle was no longer aimed at Veronica. Instead, he turned to the second officer, his voice cold and sharp. "Stop recording." Veronica's stomach twisted. She knew what that meant. The second officer hesitated, but then he started to move toward the witness. A hand slowly reached down to her waist, where Veronica knew something dangerous was. "No, not this time." She took a step forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Touch him and I'll personally charge you with obstruction of justice." The words stopped the officer in his tracks. The air was filled with uncertainty, and Veronica sensed the power dynamic shift, if only slightly. The sirens grew closer, echoing through the deserted streets. A few seconds later, Kearns was no longer looking at her. His eyes moved past her, toward the approaching flashing lights. Veronica recognized that look, desperation. And desperate men, she knew, made desperate choices. She had only seconds to do something, to make sure everyone got out of this safely. But would that be enough? The sirens were deafening now. Patrol lights danced across the pavement as cars skidded to a stop. The witness clutched his phone, the red recording light glowing like an unblinking eye. Veronica stood still, not daring to move. Kearns still held his weapon, but his posture had changed. The arrogant confidence from before was gone, replaced by tension and panic. The car doors opened, and officers poured out. Their hands hovered near their holsters, but no one had drawn their weapons. They had no idea what they were walking into. And then, one of them recognized Director Caldwell. His name pierced the tense air like a bullet. Kearns barely reacted, but the second officer froze. His mouth opened, but no words came out. A lieutenant stepped forward, badges gleaming on his chest. He scanned the scene before him, trying to make sense of what was happening. Veronica stood there, arms raised, eyes fixed on Kearns. And Kearns, he was still clutching his gun. The second officer stood there, suspended in indecision, uncertain what to do next. The air was tense, so tense that every second felt like a wait. And then the witness's camera began recording, not missing a single moment. The lens was trained on Veronica, recording every moment she lost control of the situation, or perhaps regained it. The moment she let her hands fall to her sides, it wasn't a surrender. It was an assertion, a reclamation of control that no one dared deny. "Lieutenant, I want these officers arrested now," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. Her orders were clear, unambiguous. The second officer took a step back, his eyes wavering. But before he could open his mouth to argue, Veronica cut in. "Stop holding back," she shouted, her voice razor-sharp, cutting through the silence. Any excuses fell apart in the face of her determination. She pointed to the witness, where the phone was still spinning, still locked but certainly not missing anything. The lieutenant hesitated, and Veronica could see the gears turning in his head. This was no longer a poorly controlled situation, this was a disaster that could end the career of anyone who let it go. Finally, the lieutenant's fingers left the gun. He slowly slid it back into its holster, each movement tightly controlled, but the expression on his face was one of suppressed rage. Veronica held his gaze, and this time, she wasn't the one who was afraid. "It was a misunderstanding," the lieutenant said, but his low, shaky voice only made the excuse sound more pathetic. Veronica tilted her head, her eyes sharp. "Then let's clear it up at headquarters. Call internal affairs. Call the DA. This isn't going away." The second officer swallowed, his face pale. And then, finally, the lieutenant acted. He turned to the nearest officer. "Cuff them both." "Kearns, you can't be serious," the officer protested, his voice rough and laced with disbelief, the kind of disbelief that only people who believe they can never be held accountable for. But this time, Veronica didn't flinch. "You held the director of the FBI at gunpoint, Officer Kearns," she said, her voice low but commanding. "If you want to add resisting arrest to that list, I won't stop you." She had spent her career seeing justice come close. And this time, she wasn't going to let it slip away. Veronica stood in the red and blue lights of the patrol car, her heart pounding but her mind steady. The scene before her was nothing new, the red tape, the needless delays of the system, and most of all, innocent people being treated like criminals. Kearns was still panting, the click of handcuffs around his wrists familiar yet different. The second cop didn't resist, he just stood there, staring at the ground with the defeated look of someone who had finally realized he was on the wrong side. The lieutenant turned to Veronica, his voice firm. "The chief's a friend. Get them out of my sight." And just like that, it seemed like it was over. For now, at least. But Veronica knew better than to say that this wasn't just a story about two bad cops, it was a story about a system that allowed them to survive and thrive. And she had no intention of letting it all go. What happened next was louder than the night. The click of the handcuffs around Kearns's wrists was more than the sound of metal on metal, it was the weight of consequences, something he'd spent years avoiding. Kearns stood still, his face twisted in disbelief as he and his partner were led toward the patrol car. Veronica recognized that look, the look of men who believed they were invulnerable, until they weren't. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Anger wouldn't help her now, action was what was needed. The witness was still standing, phone lowered but still recording. His eyes met hers. "Are you okay?" he asked. Veronica nodded, but his next words stung, "They do this all the time. But not to someone like you." He was right. This wasn't new. Only this time, Veronica had the power to change it. More officers gathered. Some glanced at Kearns and his men with barely concealed judgment. The lieutenant from before approached Veronica, his voice cautious. "Director Caldwell, would you like to personally file charges?" Veronica shook her head, her gaze hard. "This is not personal. This is justice." That morning, Dawn barely breaking through the darkness of a long, stormy night, Veronica was in the office, her face untired but her eyes determined. "This is the system I'm going to file an official report on," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I want all internal issues resolved immediately." The lieutenant sighed, rubbing the back of his neck nervously, knowing she wouldn't stop. "I also want access to both of our disciplinary records," Veronica continued. "Complete transparency." The lieutenant hesitated, but Veronica's piercing gaze made it impossible to duck. "If you think I'm going to let this go, you don't know who you're talking to," she warned. There was a long silence, and then, with a reluctant nod, the lieutenant agreed. "I'll make the call." "Very well," Veronica said. "Because this isn't just a simple traffic stop. This is all stuff that was never recorded." Before dawn, the footage was aired. By noon, the Justice Department had announced an official investigation. Kearns was stripped of his badge and arrested for assault with a deadly weapon. His partner was suspended indefinitely. The police department issued a public statement, a carefully worded report, a kind of damage control. But the world had seen the truth. And the truth had consequences. Veronica watched the news from her office, her fingers curled under her chin. The story spread at breakneck speed. She knew what was coming next: the calls, the press conferences, the political maneuvering from people who pretended to care but secretly wished she'd given up. But she never did. The phone rang. An unfamiliar number. Normally she would have ignored it, but tonight she picked it up. "Director Caldwell," the familiar voice said. "A witness from that night. I just want to say that I appreciate what you're doing. Most people wouldn't do that." Veronica leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Most people don't have the strength to do that," she replied. There was a long silence, and then the voice whispered, "But you do." For the first time in a long time, Veronica felt something akin to hope. Justice never happens in silence. It only happens when people speak up, refusing to turn away from the truth. Make sure you're paying attention. If this story touches you, share it. Speak up. And never let the truth be forgotten.